Surprise, surprise, the Dallas Cowboys season is officially over. Sitting at 6-8-1, already eliminated for the playoffs with 2 games left to go and 2 big opportunities to finish 8-8-1, aka the epitome of mid in the NFL. Welcome back to another video. It's Isaiah here, and hopefully we don't get too much of Chop Zay. You know, I really need a haircut bad, so hopefully next video we will have a haircut by then. But today we are gonna go through a deep dive of the Dallas Cowboys 2025 offseason, and we are going to review it to see how it directly affected this season, because there's a lot to discuss and there's a lot that went wrong. Even though we're going to be focusing on a lot that went wrong for the Dallas Cowboys in terms of what happened this offseason, there were some things that went right, specifically 2 names, and that's George Pickens and Javonte Williams. Starting off with the George Pickens trade, I remember where I was when this trade went down. It was 6 a.m. It was right before a history of jazz exam that I had that morning. But I remember waking up for it, and George Pickens all of a sudden was a Dallas Cowboy. Shout out Ricky, my number one dog insider in the NFL world, for breaking the news first. But when that news dropped, I had a really good feeling about what this Dallas Cowboys offense could be, because George Pickens reminded me of a more talented version of Michael Gallup, a faster version of Michael Gallup. And if you remember what Michael Gallup was for Dak Prescott, then you knew George Pickens was going to be special. And in his first year as a Dallas Cowboy, his prove-it year for the Dallas Cowboys, he definitely made more than just an impression. He became one of the elite wide receivers in the NFL. And it was a really good return investment for Jerry Jones, who only had to pay for a 3rd and a 5th round pick in exchange for potentially a second-team All-Pro, Pro Bowl caliber wide receiver. And it's had its shaky moments for sure, like the Detroit game. Obviously, that was probably the worst game George Pickens played this year. Some lazy routes led to an interception and just lazy play after CeeDee Lamb went down. But aside from that game, he was really the bright spot on the offense this year and just really made it the elite group that it was in 2025. The Cowboys aren't the number 1 offense in the league without George Pickens and his exceptional play. So credit Jerry in the front office for making that type of move and helping Dak Prescott get his wide receiver 2/wide receiver 1 beat. And then the other big move that the Cowboys made was really minuscule at first, and that was Javonte Williams. When he signed here, I was pretty pessimistic about it because he had the torn Achilles in year 2. He didn't look quite the same in years 3 and 4 with Denver. But once he signed with Dallas and once he got to work with that young offensive line and Clayton Adams, the offensive coordinator, he took off. It looked like everything he could have been year 1 in Denver, that physical running style. Definitely the pass blocking on 3rd downs was some of my favorite things to watch from Javonte Williams. That physical runner that we've really been missing since the days of Zeke, specifically 2021 Zeke, pre-knee injury. If you know, you know. But Javonte Williams really brought back a violent running style that the Cowboys hadn't seen in a while. I'm really hoping they bring him back, pair him with hopefully maybe another Tony Pollard-esque type of running back to really make it that 2021, 2022 type of duo that the Cowboys had. But Javonte Williams, for the deal that he signed in the offseason, really, it was really one of the deals of the offseason. And again, credit Jerry Jones and the front office for making that move. However, even though those signings went well on the offensive end, the focus of this video will most likely just be the defense the entire time, because good Lord, man. We're going to start off with Kenneth Murray. Kenneth Murray. I mean, I remember when the news dropped that we traded for Kenneth Murray, and I almost fell down to my knees at the gym. I could not believe it. He was one of the worst linebackers in the league with the Tennessee Titans. In fact, the Titans were going to cut him before Dallas swooped in and traded, I believe, a 7th round pick for him. And even though it's just a 7th round pick, I'm sure based on the production Kenneth Murray has put up this season, the Cowboys are regretting giving away that 7th round pick, because it's been really bad. And that's the Cowboys in a nutshell, right? That's kind of how they've treated the linebacker position. They just kind of want to fill the position with names at this point rather than guys they think can actually produce. Because if you remember, Kenneth Murray was a former 1st round pick, and the Cowboys most likely dug up out of their 2019 draft board and said, this is the guy we want. So let's pick up Kenneth Murray, see if he has anything left in the tank. And turns out, just like the rest of the league suspected, He does not. He does not deserve to be a starting linebacker in the NFL right now. Definitely did not deserve green dot privileges. And I cannot think of a worse Cowboys trade in recent history than what Kenneth Murray has done for the team this year. And I think Kenneth Murray's tenure as a Dallas Cowboy this season can really be summarized in that one play he had against the Vikings on Sunday Night Football with the season on the line. I'm not going to put the clip because I don't want to get copyright striked or anything, but I'm going to reenact it for y'all. Give me a second. All right, so here was basically the play, right? So the Vikings essentially ran a fake flip on the right side to Aaron Jones, and then they ran it up the middle with C.J. Ham for a touchdown. So they run the flip, right? Aaron Jones goes this way as the decoy on the play. Kenneth Murray's like, cool. Just stay in my stance. I'm ready. I'm ready, coach. I'm going to fill that gap. I'm going to make the play. Let's go, coach. C.J. Ham gets the ball, left side of the A-gap. Kenneth Murray's like, all right, yeah. I see the play. And Kenneth Murray's right here. As C.J. Ham is going this way, and Aaron Jones is also going that way, where does Kenneth Murray go? Right in the middle where nobody is. It's one of the worst run fits I think you've ever seen from a linebacker in the history of life, in the history of football. I don't even think I would have done that 10 years old playing youth football because it was bad. It was really bad. And you know, I hope Kenneth Murray has a long career, but it just did not work out in Dallas. And I hope he just doesn't play in Arlington again. You know, in the words of Kehlani in her famous song, he needs to come pick up his clothes because he needs to get off the Cowboys, please. And that's not the only reclamation project that the Cowboys tried to work on in the offseason. Few remember this because he's actually no longer on the team. But the Cowboys also traded draft capital for former first-round pick Kaiir Elam. Now, Elam had his struggles with the Buffalo Bills, right? He was supposed to be their lockdown corner of the future, very athletic, very rangy. But he got burnt, and he got burnt a lot. And that happened quite a bit in 2024 to the point where he got benched. The Bills eventually drafted his future replacement in Maxwell Hairston in 2025. So they decided to ship him off, and the Cowboys were like, yep, we're jumping on it. He was on our draft board a couple years ago. He's on our team. You know the story by now with the Cowboys. And that move was essentially to firm up the Cowboys' depth. But in classic Cowboys fashion, there were injuries in the cornerback room to start the year. And it was Deron Bland, of course. Trayvon Diggs and Deron Bland cannot play on the field ever at the same time. So Kaiir Elam takes the position. He plays a lot of outside corner to start the year. And he was really bad. No surprise here. I mean, from what we saw from Kaiir Elam, from weeks 2 to 4, they played the Giants, the Bears, and the Packers, and almost gave up a combined 1,000 yards passing in 3 games, and that's mostly because teams were targeting Kaiir Elam on the outside. Receivers who had big games, Malik Neighbors, Romeo Doubs had 3 touchdowns on the Cowboys' head, as well as Roma Dunze for the Chicago Bears also having a big day, which also assisted essentially Caleb Williams' breakout game in the NFL. And then, of course, the trade on the defensive side of the ball, the Micah Parsons trade. You know, I've kind of waited to talk about it for a while in this video just because what is there left to say, but this is what really caused the downfall of the Cowboys defense more than anything. And I'm going to get into Matt Eberflus and his contributions to the Dallas Cowboys downfall this year defensively, but you don't start with your first-year defensive coordinator on your staff and say, hey, by the way, I know you've been scheming up Micah Parsons all offseason long to be the guy, the leader in your defense, the catalyst. We're going to trade him. We don't like him anymore. Do something else. Drop something else. You know, we got Micah Parsons at home, and it's Jadeveon Clowney. To simply put it, this is what bad organizations do. Jerry Jones got ego checked by an agent and said, we want to do this our way so we can do it the right way. And Jerry Jones just refused to do anything with the agent, and it was just a bad situation all around. Now, Jerry Jones likes to play victim in the media in terms of the Micah Parsons trade. He said, well, we got to do it. You know, our run defense has been bad all year long, right? We couldn't stop anything with San Francisco in the playoff games. Couldn't do anything with the Packers in the playoff games. And essentially, it's all Micah Parsons' fault. So why would I just pay him $50 million if he can't stop the run by himself, right? I know there's 10 other guys on the field, but I blame it on Micah. it's all his fault. And then he also tried to say Micah Parsons getting injured for a lengthy amount of time for the first time in his career last season was on him and another reason to pay. None of it just ever made any sense. And just the lack of logic really applied to the football field because right out the gate, you could tell the Cowboys were missing Micah Parsons, and it was bad. Let me just go down the list of all the games that the Cowboys lost since trading Micah Parsons, because if they have a Micah Parsons in these games early on, then arguably we're sitting here and talking about the Cowboys as the division leader in the NFC and possibly a wild card team right now. Starting out with week 1 immediately after trading Micah Parsons, right? It showed on defense because this team could not sack Jalen Hurts to save his life. Any third down, he was escaping. He was using his legs. He was finding Dallas Goedert after scrambling. And that's the biggest difference maker that Micah Parsons brings to the table. That ability to chase down a mobile quarterback like a Jalen Hurts on the field. I go down to the Bears game. Again, a game with zero pass rush whatsoever. Caleb Williams had all the time in the world to throw and dice up that very, 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 very bad secondary that the Dallas Cowboys were employing at that time. The Packers game, specifically the last drive, right? Dak Prescott leads another great drive. Brandon Aubrey hits a field goal to possibly win the game. All the Cowboys have to do is get a stop, and the Packers are already backed up at, I believe, the 15-yard line with little time left. What does the defense do? Well, they can't even get close to Jordan Love, and they allow the Packers to drive all the way down the field to tie the game in overtime, and the game ends in a tie. That's a game they could have really used Micah Parsons, especially in a big NFC matchup like that Green Bay game. That's a difference maker. So that's already 3 games they lost early in the year that they could have used a Micah Parsons, especially the Carolina Panthers game. That was a game the Cowboys had. They were going to win that game if they could get one stop on defense. And I believe they had about 6.5 minutes on the clock, if not 5.5 minutes, to get one stop. They did not get one stop. And Jerry Jones spent all offseason talking about how bad Micah Parsons was against the run. Well, who was good then? Who was good? Because it wasn't this game. Because Rico Dowdle said, buckle up, and he ran all over them. I had him on my fantasy team that week. I could tell you, he ran all over them. That's a game the Cowboys lose because they cannot get one stop defensively. Some other games they lost. Week 9, Arizona. That was the game where the glimmer was lost in my eyes after that one. I mean, just any hope that was left into the season, lost. Completely lost. And the D-line played pretty well that game, but early on in the first quarter when Jacoby Brissett was dicing him up, you needed a Micah Parsons because Jacoby Brissett is a statue in the pocket. And that Arizona offensive line is pretty shaky outside of Paris Johnson at left tackle. So that's another game where if they have a Micah Parsons, they win the game. And of course, you're going to have your eternal optimists in the Cowboys fan base, your Jerry Jones truthers of the world. We're going to look at what's happened with the Micah Parsons trade so far, getting Quinnen Williams and Micah Parsons actually tearing his ACL, which may help the Cowboys draft pick in the next couple weeks here. And you say, hey, maybe the Cowboys did win the trade. But you just can't deny that the process of how they went about trading Micah Parsons, it just made no sense. If you were going to trade Micah Parsons, you should have done it in April right before the draft. So you were prepared to replace him immediately. But they didn't do that. They waited up until the last second to make a real decision on Micah Parsons. They played with Micah Parsons' money. I know there was a lot of complaints about what Micah Parsons did on the sideline, right? Throwing a temper tantrum or what they call it. If you were getting shafted out of a potentially $200 million contract because the owner won't speak to your agent, would you not act like that too? That's generational money. We're not just talking about some part-time job that you were applying for, right? This is a lot of money that could quite literally, not just a joke, but quite literally feed your family for generations, right? I would be Micah Parsons too in that situation. I'm not going to lie to y'all. And then it's just the fact that you trade him to the Packers the Green Bay Packers. That team ruined my childhood. I can't look at Aaron Rodgers without tearing up because he ruined my life, man. He ruined it. You just can't trade him to Green Bay, right? They just beat you 2 years ago. They're a big NFC threat, and you knew this. especially because they're in the same conference. I'll say this again. They're in the same conference as you, competing for a Super Bowl, and you say we're going to trade him there. And we're going to get a Kenny Clark who is still serviceable, but not the elite all-pro Kenny Clark he was a couple years ago. We're going to trade for 2 draft picks that we know are going to be in the bottom half. And we're going to see how this works out. It didn't make any sense. Like I said earlier, if you were going to trade him, you trade him in April, see who has the highest bidder, instead of settling for what you consider the best package at the time. And what the time was the worst possible time to trade somebody right before the season starts. Because at that point, everyone knows you're just trying to get rid of him. And it was bad judgment. It was bad business for anybody. And it really contributed into how the Dallas Cowboys season played out. We're going to start out with some of the extensions, starting with Jake Ferguson. And while I was a big Jake Ferguson fan during his sophomore breakout year, it hasn't worked out so far. He put up some good numbers, had some nice touchdowns at the beginning of the year, but he's just not the same tight end production-wise, especially after the catch. It's been really disappointing to see how much he's regressed in terms of yard after catch when this should be the prime of his career, especially post-extension. It just seems like he's not the same route runner. He's not as physical, right? He's getting destroyed, especially by DBs for some reason, at the point of attack where he should be breaking tackles. I hope it's different for year 5, and I hope he gets a little bit stronger in that aspect. But in terms of yards after catch and the drops and even some of the fumble issues in the biggest moments, so far, it hasn't worked out for Dallas. Osa Odighizuwa's contract extension is what I would consider a good overpay. He's a pretty good pass rusher, and I think it was somebody you couldn't let out of the building. So I'm glad that they paid him. Was it an overpay? Yes, for sure. But again, can't let him out the building. I thought it was a good signing. Now, DaRon Bland, this was a massive overpay, and it's something I would have waited on personally, but they felt like he was the future at the cornerback position. They moved him primarily to the outside this year. And again, it's just like Jake Ferguson, and it hasn't worked out so far. I couldn't tell you if it was scheme specific because he played a lot more zone than he was used to. He's used to being a man-to-man corner specifically, but even in man, he was getting torched this year, especially that Cardinals game against Marvin Harrison Jr., which really was Marv's breakout game on the biggest stage against DaRon Bland. Like, he was hitting the nay-nay at one point. Like, it was crazy. That was a crazy game to watch. But yeah, for the money they paid DaRon Bland this offseason as an all-pro type of corner, it just has not worked out so far, and the return investment has not been there for Jerry Jones. And this is a really important contract, too, because this contract was signed and finalized right after they paid Micah Parsons. So essentially, they prioritize a corner like DaRon Bland over an elite pass rusher like Micah Parsons. Now we got to talk about the coaching staff, and there were obviously some big additions made in the offseason. After essentially letting Mike McCarthy go, the Cowboys handpicked Brian Schottenheimer as their next head coach. And obviously, he was not the sexiest name out there. There was a Ben Johnson, who was the hottest coach on the coaching wire, if you want to call it that, right? The coaching landscape out there. He was the name to go after. And then you had another option like Aaron Glenn, who was also on that Lions staff with Ben Johnson and a former Dallas Cowboy himself. There was Bill Belichick, who was constantly rumored for that Dallas Cowboys job. Obviously, they did not go out and pursue Bill Belichick because he went off to do his shenanigans in North Carolina. So they go after Brian Schottenheimer, their offensive coordinator under Mike McCarthy for a couple years, and he had some other runs like the Let Russ Cook years in Seattle, and of course the runs with the New York Jets in the early 2010s, where they made back-to-back AFC Championship appearances with that elite Rex Ryan defense and Mark Sanchez with LaDainian Tomlinson and Santonio Holmes. And for me, Brian Schottenheimer was okay. I thought there were a lot of positives. I thought the offense looked very good. It was fluid, a lot more motion, right? I love the crossers that he had really established. No more of that curl route crap that we saw from Kellen Moore and Mike McCarthy that really hindered the Cowboys offense a couple years ago. But it was a very good-looking offense for the most part. But the thing that scares me about Brian Schottenheimer as a play caller is that when it's time to make the big decision, he is way too conservative. He's been quoted multiple times this season in regards to his father, Marty Schottenheimer, of course, one of the greatest offensive minds that the league has ever seen. But Marty Schottenheimer also came from an old school NFL where take the points was always going to be essential and situations. But in today's NFL, that mindset just does not work because there are so many other factors in play like analytics and the fact that you need to score to keep up with all of these top offensive teams in the NFL. Too often, I thought we saw Brian Schottenheimer be extremely conservative when they needed points. And it reminded me too much of Jason Garrett. That's not where the similarities stop. I think both of these guys are good locker room guys, right? They're good coaches in general. But in terms of how both of them came up, it's just eerily similar, right? You replace two good coaches like they did Wade Phillips for Jason Garrett, like Mike McCarthy for Brian Schottenheimer, to promote basically who they thought were offensive gurus, like the future of the NFL. And now these were two guys who were extremely conservative. Jason Garrett, specifically in 2019, who remembers, I remember, that season terrorized me. He was often way too scared to go for it on fourth down. And it lost the Cowboys a lot of games and basically got them eliminated from the playoffs in that last 5-game stretch. And that's my biggest fear with Brian Schottenheimer as a play caller. If he doesn't get more aggressive in his approach, then I think it's going to spell doom for the Cowboys for years to come, because this team will be a playoff team next year, if not the year after that. There's so much positive momentum. There's so much talent on the roster. They're going to be in the playoffs sooner rather than later. My biggest fear is when it comes to the big playoff moments where you need points as often as possible, right? And it's more than just field goals. Even though you're confident in Brandon Aubrey, you can't rely on 3 points every single drive. You need to punch it into the end zone. And that's my biggest fear for Brian Schottenheimer, is he's too often going to take the points and think about what his father would have done back in the 90s and the 2000s and not focus on today's NFL, where you have teams like Detroit who are always going for it. You have teams like the Rams who are even often going for it in their own territory on 4th and 1. That's today's NFL, and too often Brian Schottenheimer has been a little too scared of making that big move on 4th down. And then, of course, Matt Eberflus. Matty. And like I said earlier, I thought Matt Eberflus was dealt a bad hand to begin his Dallas Cowboys tenure as offensive coordinator because they traded Micah Parsons a week before the season. He was quoted so many times talking about how special Micah was and how he was going to be the leader of this defense and how everything he was scheming up was around Micah just for them to trade him. That was already a bad start. And then I think the roster around him was not a Matt Eberflus roster. It was not fit for his zone-heavy scheme. Corners like Trayvon Diggs and Deron Bland, those are man-to-man corners. Those are guys who are feeding off of interceptions because the D-line is so dominant. But you place them in zone, and that's where you can take advantage. And when you have that zone-heavy look that Matt Eberflus often leans on, especially on third downs, that's where you can pick those type of corners apart. And that's what led to the biggest downfall for the Cowboys this year. And then, of course, the added linebacker play. You have so many linebackers in coverage who just can't do it. They can't do it in coverage. Jack Sanborn specifically, he's a one-down linebacker. Logan Wilson had some solid moments, right? He was an okay trade, but just not fast enough to really guard in zone coverage. And then Kenneth Murray, right? Maurice Liufau cannot cover anybody to save his life. And Overshown came on late. We're not going to include him in that. But they were just not fits in Matt Eberflus' system whatsoever. And you got to remember, when Matt Eberflus was the defensive coordinator for the Indianapolis Colts, he had Shaq Leonard, who was an all-pro linebacker and one of the best coverage linebackers in the NFL. You go from that to whatever core they were working with in Dallas, just not the same. But Matt Eberflus had so many flaws because he was terrible in situational play calling defensively. He relied on that zone look way too often, especially against the Philadelphia Eagles in week 1, where I think everyone could tell this defense was not going to be anything. I think most of their plays were in zone, and Matt Eberflus did not adjust to that whatsoever, and he basically dared Jalen Hurts to beat him with his legs, and Jalen Hurts said, okay, sure, I'll do that. That's easy. That's what I want to do, you know? Like, he got fooled on that, and it led to the Cowboys losing that pivotal week 1 game against Philly. And of course, hiring Matt Eberflus so far has been a mistake, but I think the biggest mistake the Cowboys made in finding their next DC was making it too quick. It was almost like Matt Eberflus was already in the building. It was just poof, and he's already there. They really overlooked a guy like Al Harris, who has just done miracles so far in Chicago. He's helped Chicago turn into one of the best secondaries and one of the top teams in terms of taking the ball away, just like he did in Dallas with Trevon Diggs and Deron Bland over the years. I think you could have kept a guy like that in the building, really established the same scheme that you already had. The players were already very familiar with Al Harris. Everyone seemed to like him, but they just didn't do too much to retain him after Mike McCarthy was gone, and it just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. If you are already hiring a guy from within like Brian Schottenheimer, why not do everything in your power to retain a guy like Al Harris, who you know has been pivotal in making your defense elite over the years, especially what they've done for the cornerback room in terms of taking the ball away, because he did so many great things in Dallas. I just don't see why he didn't spend more time in Dallas in a new position. Overall, the Cowboys offseason did not translate well to the 2025 season, but there are plenty of things to look forward to. Dak Prescott is still in the middle of his quarterback prime. You have CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens, who, if Pickens is retained, then you have arguably the best wide receiver duo in the NFL. Plus, now you have Quinnen Williams anchoring your defensive line, who is one of the best defensive tackles. And we know how rare all-pro defensive tackles are in the NFL. Plus, you have 2 first-round draft picks in the 2026 NFL draft. So, while the season was dim, there is plenty to look forward to in the Brian Schottenheimer era. So hopefully we'll get back to relevancy very soon, because I don't know how much more I can take. Very serious. But thank you guys for joining. Stick around for more videos in the future, and I'll see you all next time.